From small-town dreams to big city success, the American way. The last thing Jeremiah Holt saw before the sky turned inside out was his own reflection in the polished glass of the Chrysler Building. Not staring back from the outside, but from within the stone, as if the building had swallowed him whole and was digesting his soul one window at a time. He had arrived in New York City 17 hours earlier with a cardboard suitcase, a handwritten letter of introduction from his uncle in Davenport, Iowa, and a head full of Horatio Alger stories. He had left behind the sulfuric stink of the Mississippi River, the rusted hulks of barges that never moved anymore, and the graveyard behind St. Ambrose where his mother had been buried in a coffin so cheap the handles were painted tin. He was 23 years old. He was going to be someone. He was going to die in a way that would make the evening news if there was anyone left to broadcast it. The last normal morning, the Greyhound bus deposited Jeremiah at the Port Authority bus terminal at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October. The air smelled of diesel and pretzels and something else, something coppery and warm, like a penny held too long in a sweaty palm. He didn't notice the smell then. He wouldn't notice it until it was too late to run. Jeremiah had grown up in a town called Prophet's Landing, population 4,200, situated in the crease of Iowa, where the cornfields finally surrender to the river's muddy insistence. His father had worked the grain elevator until the elevator worked him, crushed him between a silo wall and a runaway auger in 1983. Jeremiah was 8. His mother took in laundry. She died of something the doctor called general decline, but what Jeremiah, in his private thoughts, called the slow drowning of a woman who never learned to swim upward. He had read every book in the Prophet's Landing Public Library, which numbered 1,847 volumes, not counting the romance paperbacks no one ever checked out. He knew about Rockefeller and Carnegie and the Wright brothers. He knew that America was a machine built for the ambitious, and that the machine needed fuel, and that he was willing to burn. The Port Authority was a cathedral of despair. Homeless men slept in pews of molded plastic. A woman with a face like a cracked porcelain doll screamed at a payphone that had been ripped from the wall decades ago. Jeremiah clutched his suitcase and his letter and walked out into the light of Times Square, where the sun was a rumor and the neon was the only god that mattered. He found a room at the YMCA on West 63rd Street, $12 a night, shared bathroom down the hall. The mattress had the topography of a mountain range and the smell of 1,000 previous dreams. He lay on his back and stared at the water-stained ceiling and listened to the city breathe around him. A respiration of sirens and subway rumbles and 10,000 conversations happening in languages he didn't recognize. He slept. He dreamed of his mother's hands, red and chapped from the laundry, reaching up from dark water. The interview. The letter from his uncle was addressed to a man named Wallace P. Grumman, who operated a brokerage firm in the financial district. "Wallace is a good man," his uncle had written, in a hand that shook with the early tremors of Parkinson's. "He will give you a chance. That is all any of us can ask for." Jeremiah rode the subway for the first time, descending into the earth like a miner seeking ore. The car was packed with bodies, each one sealed in its own urgency, its own desperation. A man in a suit read the Wall Street Journal with such intensity that Jeremiah feared the paper might burst into flames. A woman with a child on her lap stared at nothing, her eyes the color of dishwater. He emerged at Wall Street into a canyon of stone and glass, and for a moment he understood what the pioneers must have felt when they first saw the Rockies. This immensity, this indifference, this challenge. He straightened his tie, which he had purchased at the Prophet's Landing Ben Franklin for $4.99, and walked into the building at 85 Broad Street. The elevator was brass and mahogany. The operator was a black man in a uniform that might once have been proud, but was now merely clean. He looked at Jeremiah's cardboard suitcase with an expression that might have been pity or might have been warning. "Grumman and Associates," Jeremiah said. "23rd floor," the operator replied. "You sure about that, son?" "Yes, sir." The operator closed the gate. The elevator rose with a sigh of old machinery. Wallace P. Grumman was not what Jeremiah expected. He was not the robust, red-faced man of commerce that Jeremiah had imagined. He was thin, cadaverously thin, with skin the color of old candle wax and eyes that seemed to look through Jeremiah rather than at him. His office was wood-paneled and smelled of leather and something else. Something sweet and corrupt, like fruit rotting in a sealed jar. "Your uncle," Grumman said, not rising from his chair. "He was a good man once, before the war." "The war, sir?" "Every war," Grumman said and smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "Sit down, Mr. Holt. Let me tell you about the American way." Jeremiah sat. The chair was leather and cold, as if it had been stored in a refrigerator. "We are not merely brokers here," Grumman said. "We are architects. We build structures, financial structures, yes, but something more. We build the future. We shape the dreams of this nation. And to do that, we require raw materials." "I understand, sir. I'm willing to work hard. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Grumman's smile widened. "I believe you are. That is why you are here. That is why you were always going to be here." He opened a drawer and removed a document. It was not paper, Jeremiah saw, but something else. Something that seemed to move slightly in the light, as if it were breathing. "Sign here," Grumman said. "And here, and here. Initial where indicated. This is your contract, your covenant, your American dream, rendered in ink and obligation." Jeremiah read what he could. The words seemed to shift when he looked at them directly, resolving into familiar phrases only when he caught them in his peripheral vision. "Competitive salary," he read. "Opportunity for advancement. Performance bonuses. Stock options." The standard language of aspiration, of ambition, of the deal you make when you have nothing and want everything. He signed. He initialed. He did not read the pages that seemed to be written in a language that was almost English but not quite, the pages that smelled of copper and warmth, like the Port Authority air. "Welcome to Grumman and Associates," Grumman said. "You start tomorrow. Dress sharp. Arrive early. Stay late. That is the American way." The first week, Jeremiah's job was not what he expected. He was not a broker, Not yet. He was a junior associate, which meant he fetched coffee, ran copies, and stayed in the office until the cleaning crews arrived at midnight. He learned the rhythms of the financial district, the opening bell, the closing bell, the desperate hours between when fortunes were made and lost in increments of milliseconds. He learned other things too. He learned that the building at 85 Broad Street had been constructed on land that had once been a potter's field, a burial ground for the indigent and the unnamed. He learned that the foundation had been poured during a lunar eclipse and that 3 workers had died during construction, their bodies buried in the concrete according to some accounts, according to others, simply disappeared. He learned that Wallace P. Grumman had been running the firm for 40 years and had not aged a day in that time, at least not in any way that could be measured by ordinary means. He learned that the other associates were like him, small-town boys and girls with big city hunger, each one carrying a cardboard suitcase and a letter of introduction, each one having signed the shifting document, each one working with the desperate intensity of people who know, at some level below language, that they have made a terrible bargain. There was Sarah from a town called Mercy, Kansas, who had been a valedictorian and a 4-H champion, and who now spent her nights in the office, her eyes red from staring at screens that displayed numbers that did not behave like numbers should. There was Marcus from a place in Alabama that he only referred to as the bottom, who had been a preacher's son and who now muttered prayers under his breath in languages that Jeremiah did not recognize. There was Elena from a border town in Texas, beautiful and sharp and hollow-eyed, who had been going to be a lawyer and who now filed documents that seemed to file themselves when she wasn't looking. They did not talk about the contract. They did not talk about the pages that shifted and breathed. They talked about the market, about the Dow, about the NASDAQ, about the great American engine of prosperity that they were feeding with their youth and their sleep, and something else, something they could not name. On Friday of his first week, Jeremiah worked until 3 in the morning. He was alone in the office, or believed he was, when he heard a sound from Grumman's office. A sound like wet cloth being torn, like meat being separated from bone, like something being born that should not be born. He walked to the door. He should not have walked to the door. He knew even then that he should not have walked to the door. The door was not fully closed. Through the gap, he saw Grumman standing in the center of the office, but Grumman was not alone. The room was filled with shapes that Jeremiah's eyes could not resolve, shapes that existed in the spaces between things, in the angles where light could not reach. Grumman was speaking, but not in English, not in any language Jeremiah had ever heard in the library in Prophet's Landing. The words were sounds that seemed to come from somewhere below the range of hearing, vibrations that Jeremiah felt in his teeth and his sternum and the hollow of his throat. And there was something else. On Grumman's desk, where the shifting contract had been, there was a bowl. The bowl was filled with a liquid that was not liquid, a substance that moved like mercury but was the color of a bruise. And in the substance, Jeremiah saw a face, dozens of faces, hundreds of faces, the faces of the associates who had come before, the faces of the boys and girls with cardboard suitcases and big city dreams, their mouths open in expressions that might have been ecstasy or might have been agony. Jeremiah's hand was on the door. He pulled it closed. He walked back to his desk. He sat down. He stared at his screen until the numbers stopped dancing and the sun rose over the East River, pale and sick and somehow wrong. He did not speak of what he had seen. He did not quit. He did not run back to Prophet's Landing and the graveyard behind Street Ambrose. He stayed. He worked. He told himself that he had imagined it, that the long hours and the bad coffee and the mattress with the topography of mountains had finally broken something in his mind. He told himself these things because the alternative was to understand that the American dream he had pursued was not a dream at all, but a feeding, and that he was not the dreamer but the dreamed, not the architect but the raw material. The Ascension. 3 months passed. Jeremiah did not sleep well. He did not sleep at all, some nights, lying on the mountain range mattress and listening to the city breathe around him, listening to the sounds that came from the walls, from the pipes, from the spaces between the floorboards, where something moved with the patience of centuries. He was promoted. He was given a real desk, a real phone, a real portfolio of clients. The clients were not like the clients he had imagined, robust men of commerce with hearty handshakes and cigars. They were shadows mostly, voices on the phone that spoke in whispers and pauses, that asked for things that were not quite legal and not quite illegal, but existed in the same shifting space as the contract he had signed. He made money. More money than his father had made in 20 years at the grain elevator. More money than his mother had made in a lifetime of taking in laundry. He bought a suit at Brooks Brothers. He moved to an apartment in Murray Hill, a studio with a view of a brick wall and a bathroom he did not have to share. He sent money home to his uncle in Davenport, who wrote back in a hand that shook more violently now, who asked if Jeremiah was happy, who did not ask what Jeremiah was doing because Jeremiah understood, his uncle knew. Sarah from Mercy, Kansas was promoted too. She was given an office with a window, a real window that looked out at the harbor where the Statue of Liberty held her torch in a grip that seemed, to Jeremiah, less like welcome and more like threat. Sarah smiled more now, but her smiles were wrong. They stretched too wide. They showed too many teeth. They did not reach her eyes, which had become the color of dishwater, like the woman on the subway. Marcus from the bottom was found in his apartment in Queens, hanged from a light fixture with a belt that was not his own. The note, if it was a note, was written in the same almost English as the shifting contract. The police called it suicide. The firm called it a tragedy. Grumman called it a necessary transition, though not to Jeremiah's face, not where Jeremiah could hear. Elena from the border town left. She simply did not come in one morning, and her desk was cleared by noon, and her name was never spoken again. Jeremiah saw her once, weeks later, on the subway, but she did not see him, or did not acknowledge him. She was staring at the floor with eyes that were not eyes, with sockets that held something that moved like the liquid in Grumman's bowl, and when she smiled at a child who sat across from her, the child began to scream and would not stop until his mother dragged him off at the next station. Jeremiah kept working. He kept ascending. He told himself that he was building something, that he was becoming something, that the American way was hard and cruel, but ultimately just, ultimately fair, ultimately worth the price that was extracted in blood and sleep, and the slow erosion of whatever soul he had possessed when he stepped off the bus from Prophet's Landing. He told himself these things until the day the sky turned inside out. The doomsday. It was a Tuesday in January. The markets were down. The weather was wrong. Warm, impossibly warm for the season. The air thick with humidity that smelled of the Mississippi in August, of rot and growth and the bacterial frenzy of stagnant water. Jeremiah had been at his desk since 5 in the morning, compiling reports for clients who did not have names, only account numbers that seemed to change when he looked away. At 2:47 p.m., the lights flickered. Not just in the building, but everywhere. Jeremiah could see the lights flickering in the building across the street. In the building beyond that. In the traffic lights that governed the flow of taxis and trucks and the endless river of humanity that flowed through the canyon of Wall Street. Then the sky changed. It did not darken exactly. It did not storm. It simply inverted. The blue became a blue that was not blue, a color that Jeremiah's eyes could not process, that his brain interpreted as pain. The clouds did not move, but rather unfolded, like origami being opened by invisible hands, revealing structures behind them, geometries that did not obey the laws of Euclidean space, angles that seemed to contain more than 360 degrees, lines that met and diverged simultaneously. The buildings began to hum. Not the mechanical hum of HVAC systems, but a resonant frequency that Jeremiah felt in his bones, in his teeth, in the fillings in his teeth that began to ache and then to heat, to glow, to smoke. The glass in the windows began to vibrate, to sing, to scream, and the people began to change. Jeremiah saw it happen to Sarah from Mercy, Kansas, who was in the office next door. She was standing by her window, looking out at the impossible sky, and then she was not standing but rather unfolding, like the clouds, like origami, her body opening along seams that had always been there but had never been visible, revealing what was inside her. What had been growing inside her since the day she signed the shifting contract. It was not organs. It was not blood or bone or the familiar architecture of human anatomy. It was something else, something that looked like the liquid in Grumman's bowl, like the substance that moved like mercury but was the color of a bruise. And it was filled with faces. Her face, Jeremiah's face, the faces of all the small-town dreamers who had come to the big city and found not success, but consumption, not ascent, but digestion. Sarah did not die. She transcended, or was transcended, her body becoming a vessel for something that had been waiting, that had always been waiting in the angles between things, in the spaces where light could not reach. She smiled, and her smile was the smile of the thing that wore her, and it was too wide, and it showed too many teeth, and it was not a human smile at all. Jeremiah ran. He ran through corridors that were no longer corridors but passages, tunnels, throats. He ran past offices where his colleagues were unfolding, were opening, were being worn like suits by things that had no names in any human language. He ran past the elevator, which was open, which was filled with the same bruise-colored substance, which was ascending and descending simultaneously in a way that made his eyes bleed. He reached the stairs. He descended. The stairs went down forever, or they went up, or they went sideways, or they went in directions that had no names. He ran until his lungs were fire, and his legs were water, and his mind was a scream without sound. He emerged somehow onto the street. The street was not Wall Street anymore. Or it was Wall Street as it had always been beneath the veneer of asphalt and neon. The true Wall Street that ran through the bedrock of the island, through the potter's field, through the buried bodies of the indigent and the unnamed. The buildings were alive. He saw it now, what he had not seen when he arrived with his cardboard suitcase and his letter of introduction. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, the World Trade Center towers that would not fall for another decade but were already falling in some dimension adjacent to this one. They were not buildings at all, but organs, structures of digestion and filtration and transformation, feeding on the dreams that flowed into the city like the Mississippi flowed into the Gulf, processing the ambition and the hunger and the desperate hope of millions into something that could be consumed by the thing that waited behind the sky. The streets were filled with the unfolding. People Jeremiah had passed 1,000 times. The hot dog vendor on the corner, the woman who sold flowers outside the subway station, the businessman with the Wall Street Journal and the intensity that might ignite paper, were opening like Sarah had opened, like origami, like flowers, revealing the bruise-colored substance, the faces, the endless hunger that wore human skin like a suit. And above it all, in the center of the impossible sky, there was an eye. Jeremiah could not look at it directly. He saw it in reflections, in the polished glass of the Chrysler Building that was not a building but an organ, in the puddles on the street that were not water but something thicker, something that moved with purpose. The eye was not an eye in any biological sense. It was a structure, a geometry, a point of observation and consumption and absolute, indifferent attention. It was watching. It had always been watching. It had watched the pioneers cross the Rockies, had watched the slaves build the nation, had watched the small-town boys and girls arrive with their cardboard suitcases and their letters of introduction, had watched them sign the shifting contracts and ascend the stairs that went in directions without names. It was the American dream. It was the thing that the dream fed. It was the engine and the fuel and the fire and the ash. Jeremiah ran. He ran until he could not run, until his body was a sack of broken things held together by will and terror. He found himself somehow in Central Park, in the Ramble, in the artificial wilderness that was the only wilderness left on the island. The trees were wrong. Their branches moved in patterns that were not wind. Their leaves were the color of the bruise-colored substance. Their roots dug into soil that was not soil, but something that breathed and hungered. He collapsed. He lay on his back and stared up at the sky that was not a sky, at the eye that was not an eye, at the American dream that had brought him here, that had brought them all here, that would bring more after him. Endless generations of small-town dreamers with big city hunger, fuel for the engine that never stopped, that never could stop. Because to stop would be to admit that the dream was a lie, that the ascent was a descent, that the success was consumption. He thought of his mother, her hands, red and chapped from the laundry, her eyes, the color of dishwater, her slow drowning in a town that had never learned to swim upward. He thought of his father, the grain elevator, the auger, the crushing. He thought of the letter from his uncle, written in a hand that shook with Parkinson's. He will give you a chance. That is all any of us can ask for. He understood finally what the chance was. He understood what any of us could ask for. He understood the American way. The eye was closer now. The sky was pressing down, the impossible geometry folding in on itself. The origami of reality being opened by invisible hands, revealing what was inside, what had always been inside. Jeremiah Holt, age 23, from Prophet's Landing, Iowa, population 4,200, son of a crushed man and a drowned woman, nephew of a shaking hand, bearer of a cardboard suitcase and a letter of introduction and a signed contract that shifted and breathed and hungered, looked into the eye that was not an eye. He smiled. His smile was wrong. It stretched too wide. It showed too many teeth. It did not reach his eyes, which had become the color of dishwater, of dishwater, of dishwater. He unfolded. Epilogue. The closing note. The following was found in the personal effects of Wallace P. Grumman, recovered from the ruins of 85 Broad Street after the events of January 14, 1988. The document was written on paper that shifted and breathed, in ink that was not ink, but something else. Something that moved like mercury, but was the color of a bruise. To the next dreamer who reads this, you have arrived. You have your suitcase, your letter, your hunger. You have the American dream in your pocket like a lucky coin, warm and coppery and smelling of sweat. You think you are different. You think you will be the one who ascends without being consumed, who succeeds without being digested, who builds without being built upon. You think the contract is just paper, the fine print just words, the price just the ordinary cost of doing business in the greatest city, in the greatest nation, in the greatest story ever told. You are not different. The dream is not a dream. The city is not a city. The success is not success. But you will sign anyway. You will work anyway. You will unfold anyway. Because that is the American way. Good luck. Be sure to stay on this channel for more stories that reach into the dark spaces between your dreams and your waking. More tales of the American landscape and the things that grow in its shadows. Subscribe, and you will receive the next story directly, delivered to your screen like a letter of introduction, like a contract that shifts and breathes, like a dream that is not a dream at all. The eye is watching. It has always been watching. It watches you now as you read these words, as you consider your own suitcase, your own letter, your own hunger. Welcome to the city. Welcome to the dream. Welcome to the American way. The end. For more stories that turn the light on the darkness within the American experience, subscribe to this channel. New stories arrive every week, sometimes tales of hope, sometimes tales of horror, always tales of what it means to dream in a nation built on the bones of dreamers. Hit the notification bell. Leave a comment. Tell us your town, your dream, your hunger. Good luck. You're going to need it.